New York City in the 1980s was a place where power didn't just exist in boardrooms or government buildings. It lived in backrooms, social clubs, construction sites, and quiet conversations that never made it into the public eye. And at the center of that hidden world was a structure that had controlled the city for decades: the Mafia. These organizations were built on silence, loyalty, and a strict code that punished attention as much as betrayal. Because the one thing that could bring everything crashing down wasn't just the law, it was exposure. But then came a man who ignored that rule completely, a man who didn't just accept attention, but embraced it, stepping into the spotlight in a way no boss before him ever had, turning court appearances into public events, turning his image into a brand, and turning himself into the most recognizable figure in organized crime in America. He wore expensive suits, moved with confidence through crowds of reporters, and carried himself like someone who believed he was untouchable. And for years, it seemed like he actually was. This is the story of John Gotti, a man whose rise to power redefined what it meant to be a mafia boss, and whose downfall proved that even the most powerful empires can collapse when the wrong decisions are made at the wrong time. John Gotti's story doesn't begin with power or influence, but with instability, pressure, and an environment that forced hard decisions early. Because being one of 13 children in a working-class family meant that attention was limited, resources were scarce, and survival often depended on adapting faster than the world around you. Born in the Bronx in 1940 and later raised in East New York, Brooklyn, Gotti grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity didn't come in traditional forms, and where the line between right and wrong was often blurred by necessity, circumstance, and the influence of the people around you. School wasn't a priority for him, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the structure of education couldn't compete with the immediate rewards and pressures of the street, where respect could be earned quickly, money could be made immediately, and identity could be shaped through action rather than patience. As he spent more time outside of classrooms and more time immersed in street culture, Gotti began forming connections with local crews, learning how influence worked at a ground level, understanding how fear could be just as effective as respect, and realizing that in the environment he was growing up in, reputation was everything. These early experiences didn't just push him toward crime, they trained him for it, giving him the instincts, the confidence, and the mindset that would later allow him to navigate one of the most dangerous worlds in America with a level of control that few ever achieved. As Gotti transitioned from small-time street activity into more structured criminal operations, his proximity to the Gambino crime family began to shape the direction of his life in a way that would become permanent. Because this wasn't just another group, it was one of the most powerful organized crime families in the United States, with influence that stretched across industries, neighborhoods, and entire sections of the city. Gotti didn't enter that world as a major player. He started at the bottom, running errands, proving reliability, and demonstrating that he could be trusted in situations where mistakes carried serious consequences. Over time, he became involved in hijacking operations at JFK Airport, which were among the most lucrative and risky criminal activities at the time, requiring coordination, timing, and a willingness to take bold action under pressure. These operations weren't just about stealing goods, they were about proving capability, and Gotti proved himself repeatedly, showing that he could operate within a system that demanded both discipline and aggression. But what truly separated him from others wasn't just his ability to generate money, it was his willingness to escalate when necessary, to use violence not as a last resort, but as a tool, and to do so without hesitation. This mindset made him valuable, but it also marked a point of no return, because once you establish yourself as someone capable of that level of action, your role within the organization changes permanently, and so does the way others see you. As Gotti's influence continued to grow, his alignment with powerful figures inside the Gambino family, particularly street-oriented leadership, positioned him on one side of an internal divide that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, because the Mafia was evolving and not everyone agreed on the direction it should take. On one side were leaders who favored traditional street operations, loan sharking, extortion, and hands-on control. And on the other were those who preferred more sophisticated, white-collar approaches that minimized risk and visibility. At the center of that second approach was Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, whose leadership style created both stability and resentment, because while his methods generated wealth, they also distanced him from the street-level operators who felt that their contributions were being undervalued. Gotti, who had built his reputation through direct action and street credibility, viewed Castellano's leadership as disconnected and ineffective, and over time that perspective hardened into opposition. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a shift in loyalty, a redefinition of where power should come from, and a belief that the family needed a different kind of leadership. In the Mafia, those kinds of beliefs don't stay internal forever, and when they surface, they often lead to decisions that can't be undone. By the time tensions reached their peak, the possibility of removing Paul Castellano had moved from unspoken thought to active planning, because in the structure of organized crime, leadership challenges aren't handled through negotiation, they are resolved through action. And that action carries consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved. On December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, Castellano arrived expecting a routine evening, unaware that the decision to end his life had already been made, and within moments of stepping out of his vehicle, he was met with gunfire that ended his role as boss and reshaped the power structure of the Gambino family instantly. The execution was public, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, sending a message not only to members of the Mafia, but to law enforcement and the public as well, that a significant shift had just taken place. The man behind that shift was John Gotti, and by orchestrating the hit without traditional approval, he didn't just remove a leader, he challenged the system itself, taking control in a way that was both bold and dangerous, because while it established his authority immediately, it also placed a target on him that would never fully disappear. Once Gotti secured his position as boss, he made a decision that redefined how power could be presented, choosing visibility over secrecy and transforming himself into a figure who existed as much in the public eye as he did within the internal structure of the Mafia. He understood that perception could amplify power, and by presenting himself as confident, composed, and untouchable, he created an image that reinforced his authority without requiring constant displays of force. His appearance became part of his identity, expensive suits, controlled demeanor, and a presence that commanded attention, and the media played a significant role in amplifying that image, turning his court appearances into events and his persona into something that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of organized crime. The nickname, the Dapper Don, wasn't just a label, It was a reflection of how he chose to operate, blending style with authority in a way that made him both recognizable and influential. But while that visibility strengthened his image in the short term, it also increased scrutiny, creating a situation where the very attention that elevated him could eventually contribute to his downfall. As legal cases continued to build against him, Gotti developed a reputation that seemed almost impossible to challenge, because despite repeated arrests and serious charges, the outcome remained the same. He walked free. This pattern created an illusion of invincibility, reinforced by media coverage and public perception, that positioned him as someone who existed beyond the reach of the legal system. Whether through weaknesses in prosecution, external interference, or the complexity of proving organized crime cases, each acquittal strengthened his position, making it increasingly difficult for opponents to challenge him effectively. The nickname, the Teflon Don, captured that reality, symbolizing the idea that nothing could stick to him, no matter how serious the accusation. But while that image dominated public perception, it also forced law enforcement to rethink their approach, shifting from short-term prosecutions to long-term investigations designed to build cases that couldn't be easily dismantled. This shift didn't produce immediate results, but it set the stage for a strategy that would eventually prove effective. Despite his strengths, his influence, and his ability to navigate situations that would have overwhelmed others, Gotti had a weakness that was fundamentally incompatible with the world he operated in, and that weakness was his willingness to speak openly in environments where silence was expected.
I'm not in the mood for toys or games or kidding. I'm not in the mood for clans. I'm not in the mood for gangs. I'm not in the mood for none of that stuff there. This is going to be a closing order till I die. Be it an hour from now, be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail. There's going to be a closing order. It's going to be, once your friends are going to be friends of ours, once your same friends will be friends of ours, it's going to be the way I say it's going to be. It'll be a closing order. A closing order. You might, because the guy is nice to you, and I'm not talking about you. I'm just saying, you might think that because your best thing makes him a good guy. He makes him a motherfucker to me. He makes him a good guy. He makes him a good guy when he's one of us to be proves he's one of us. And I'm the best judge of that, I think, right now. So, you gotta use it like say it. I want you to say it, and that's not fair.
In a system built on discretion, where information is controlled carefully and communication is often indirect, his approach created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, especially as surveillance methods became more advanced. He spoke freely during meetings, expressed opinions about members of his own organization, and allowed conversations to unfold in ways that generated records rather than disappearing into memory. Law enforcement recognized this pattern and adapted accordingly, placing recording devices in locations where those conversations occurred, gradually collecting evidence that would later form the backbone of their case. Among those closest to him was his underboss, Sammy Gravano, a figure who had played a critical role in his rise, but who would eventually face a decision that would alter the course of both of their lives. As pressure from law enforcement intensified, and the evidence against the organization became more substantial, the stability that had once defined Gotti's leadership began to weaken, because the same system that relied on loyalty also created situations where individuals were forced to choose between that loyalty and their own survival. When arrests were made in 1990, the case against Gotti was stronger than any he had faced before, not only because of the evidence collected through surveillance, but also because of the strategy being used to dismantle the organization from within. Faced with the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, Sammy Gravano made the decision to cooperate with the government, providing detailed testimony that confirmed and expanded upon the evidence already collected. This decision wasn't just significant, it was transformative, because it removed the uncertainty that often defined organized crime cases and replaced it with direct insider knowledge that could be presented clearly in court, fundamentally altering the balance of power in a way that Gotti could no longer control. When the trial began in 1992, it represented a turning point not just for Gotti, but for the broader effort to combat organized crime, because it demonstrated that the strategies developed over years of investigation could finally produce a result that had previously seemed out of reach. The evidence presented included recorded conversations, corroborated testimony, and a level of detail that left little room for interpretation, creating a case that was both comprehensive and difficult to challenge. For the first time, the image of invincibility that had defined Gotti's public persona began to break down, replaced by the reality of a legal process that was operating with a level of preparation and precision that couldn't be undermined. When the verdict was delivered, finding him guilty on multiple counts including murder and racketeering, it marked the end of his ability to influence outcomes through reputation or strategy, and the sentence of life imprisonment without parole ensured that his role in the world he had dominated was permanently over. The transition from controlling a criminal empire to existing within the confines of a maximum security prison represents a complete reversal of circumstances, and for Gotti, that reversal eliminated every factor that had previously defined his identity. Inside prison, there were no networks to manage, no influence to exert, and no opportunities to reshape perception, leaving only the reality of confinement and the consequences of past decisions. The environment itself was structured to remove autonomy, limiting movement, interaction, and access in ways that reinforced the finality of his situation. And over time, the contrast between his former life and his current reality became more pronounced, highlighting the extent of the change. In 2002, after years of imprisonment, John Gotti died from cancer at the age of 61, bringing an end to a life that had been defined by ambition, power, and a willingness to take risks that few others would consider. His death closed a chapter in the history of organized crime that had been marked by visibility, transformation, and eventual decline, leaving behind a legacy that continues to be examined, analyzed, and interpreted in different ways, depending on perspective. The story of John Gotti is not just a story about crime or power. It is a story about how decisions, personality, and environment interact to shape outcomes, and how the same qualities that contribute to success can also create the conditions for failure when they are applied without limitation or restraint. His rise demonstrated how influence can be built. His visibility showed how perception can amplify authority, and his downfall revealed how vulnerabilities, once exposed, can be impossible to recover from, even for someone who once appeared untouchable.